Hey guys, tonight we follow a quiet magnetic pull into the distant past, where tiny stones were once thought to whisper with life. Imagine, you're walking barefoot across a dusty marketplace in ancient Greece. The evening sun casts long golden shadows on worn marble columns, and the breeze smells like olives, bronze, and old paper. Somewhere nearby, someone is selling a stone that can move iron without touching it. That's when you hear a whisper. This one's alive. You stop. A bearded man in a toga holds a dark chunk of rock between thumb and forefinger, as if it might bite. It attracts, he murmurs. It desires. It has soul. You probably won't survive this, not because it's dangerous, but because it's so absurdly slow-paced and unscientific that your brain might float into a nap on its own. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing near the Aegean coast, sandals buried in sun-warmed sand, holding a small, irregular stone. It's a lodestone, magnetite, naturally magnetic, but the ancient Greeks didn't have terms like electromagnetic field or electron spin. What they had was curiosity and myths, and a talent for seeing meaning in everything. The philosopher Thales of Miletus, yeah, that guy your high school textbook probably skimmed past, once proposed that everything was alive. Stones, stars, spoons. But he reserved special awe for the lodestone. He noticed that it could attract iron without contact, without force, without any visible cause. And in his view, only things with soul could move others. So, to him, the lodestone was not just a weird rock, it was alive. Not like a squirrel or a human, sure, but imbued with a kind of internal vitality, a souche in Greek, just enough soul to act on the world around it. Now you might roll your eyes, quietly I hope, but remember this was revolutionary. Thales lived around 600 BCE when people still thought thunder came from Zeus and rivers had moods. For him to even entertain the idea of soul as natural force was scientific in its own ancient way. And here's a fun thought. The word animate literally means to give soul. So in a way, ancient thinkers were just early animators of the natural world. Every pebble, every breeze had character. The lodestone simply made its soul visible. You stroll through the agora, the open market, imagining philosophers gathered around a stone like tech bros at an Apple Store launch. It moves without touch. It finds iron. It must be alive. And you standing there, blinking slowly, wondering if that means your fridge magnet also has a personality. Even now, scientists still argue whether magnetism is best described as a field, a quantum interaction, or an emergent phenomenon of symmetry breaking. And while no physicist today would suggest your magnets have souls, well, the field is invisible. It acts across space. It affects other objects. Suspiciously soul-like. Back to ancient Greece, where you're now sitting beneath a fig tree. A child hands you a lodestone as if it's a kitten. You place it near a pile of iron filings. They twitch, move, rearrange themselves like dancers following a silent melody. There's something oddly emotional about it. Even today, you know it's just physics. Probably, but it feels like intention, like choreography, like the stone wants something. And that feeling, that intuitive tug, is exactly what led early humans to spiritualize magnetism. After all, how could something inanimate act at a distance? The only example they had was, well, People. You can speak, gesture, affect others. The lodestone did that too, just quietly. So it wasn't a leap to believe, maybe this stone isn't dead. Maybe it's whispering. Maybe it has just enough spirit to want to pull. That idea stuck around longer than you'd think. For centuries, the lodestone was used in rituals, navigational myths, even love spells. But tonight, we're only just beginning to trail its slow magnetic story. You glance once more at the stone in your palm. It's small, cool to the touch, quiet, and yet it's moved ships across oceans, sparked revolutions in science, and made people wonder, what is will? What is force? What is soul? You yawn. The philosophers continue murmuring in the background, but their voices blur into the cicadas and the crackle of an oil lamp. Above you, the sky is darkening, and stars begin to prick the fabric of dusk. Small, magnetic eyes watching silently, perhaps humming the same ancient tune. You sit cross-legged by the olive grove now, letting the cool stone press gently into your palm. Its weight is unremarkable. Its texture, a little rough, with sharp, stony edges that occasionally catch the skin. But your focus is on something deeper, what it means to hold an object that ancient Greeks believed contained a soul. Let's rewind the sleepy scroll of history just a bit. Somewhere around 600 to 500 BCE, as you walk through dimly lit temples and scroll-stacked libraries, you begin to notice a pattern. Philosophers were desperate to understand motion. What makes something move without being touched? What gives a thing its spark? You overhear their debates. Thales again, Heraclitus grumbling about fire, Anaximander waving dramatically toward the boundless. But all of them, in one way or another, circled back to the idea of soul as the great mover. To early thinkers, motion meant motive, and motive meant desire. So when a lodestone pulled a sliver of iron across a table without physical touch, it had to want something, didn't it? You imagine Thales explaining this to his students, gesturing at the stone as it pulls a shard of iron closer. See, he'd say, it moves without being moved. And the students nod slowly, pretending to understand but secretly thinking it all sounds like magic. You shift your weight in the grass. A breeze floats by, lazy and warm. Somewhere, someone is baking bread, and the air smells faintly of rosemary and char. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the lodestone not as a rock, but as a little creature, a slow, quiet one, a magnetic tortoise with a purpose. The word for soul in ancient Greek is psyche. You probably know it better from therapy sessions and personality quizzes. But back then, it was the animating force of everything. Human souls, sure, but also the soul of the cosmos. Plants had a little, animals had more, humans had too much, probably. And magnetite, it was somewhere in between, maybe more alive than a leaf, less alive than a cat. A quasi-soul, if you will, enough to move iron but not enough to ask for dinner. This wasn't metaphor to them, it was literal. The lodestone didn't represent soul, it had soul. Philosophers described it in language reserved for living beings. It yearned, it acted, it desired. And if that makes you chuckle, it's okay. Ancient ideas have that effect. But if you squint at it just right, it also makes a strange kind of poetic sense. After all, they weren't trying to be romantic, they were trying to be rational. In a world without electrons or Maxwell's equations, how else do you explain attraction across a gap? With gods? Maybe. But gods were a bit too dramatic. You needed something more subtle. Enter the idea that all things had internal purpose, a soul that guided their motion. The wind had a soul, The river, fire, stones, including those little black magnetic ones you can barely keep your eyes open for. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Even in modern terms, magnetite does something extraordinary. It aligns with Earth's magnetic field. Migratory birds use it to navigate. Scientists believe it helps them literally feel direction, like an internal compass. There's magnetite in their beaks, in their brains, and, bonus, quirky tidbit, tiny amounts in yours too. That's right, you have magnetite in your brain. Nobody's sure what it does. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Scientists still argue whether it's just a biological leftover or if it actually influences your sense of orientation. Now imagine trying to explain that 2,000 years ago. You stretch your legs and watch the sun sink lower. You picture a young philosopher arguing at sunset, robes fluttering in the coastal breeze, saying something like, "The magnet stone acts from within. It must have life." And his teacher responding, "No, no, it's divine influence, not soul." And a third interrupting, "It's invisible threads," which is pretty close to field theory if you think about it long enough and drink enough wine. Then you remember these weren't idle ideas. These people were laying the groundwork for centuries of thought. Every time they said soul, they were inching closer to what we now call force. Their metaphors were clumsy, but they were trying, and trying, especially when half asleep and under olive trees, is pretty noble. You lift the lodestone to your ear as a joke. It doesn't say anything, obviously, but a little part of you wishes it did. A whisper maybe, a hum, a sleepy, "Hey!" Instead, you just feel its pull. A very slight one, but definite. The stone wants something, or so you pretend. One of the philosophers believed that magnets were full of air. Not just any air, cosmic breath. This mystical pneuma was thought to flow through the universe, and the lodestone had simply inhaled more than most. So it exhaled attraction, like breathing out force, a soul with lungs in stone form. Again, it sounds silly, but so does the idea that a magnet works because electrons spin in aligned domains. Ever tried explaining that to a toddler? Or to your great aunt? You lie back now, the lodestone resting on your chest, its cool weight grounding you. The sky above is fading from coral to deep indigo. Stars appear one by one, not blinking, just glowing. Magnetic, maybe, in their quiet constancy. And there in the darkness, a thought floats by. If magnets once had souls, maybe everything still does. Maybe our need to assign soul to force was never about ignorance. Maybe it was about wonder. Maybe, just maybe, they were trying to stay awake in a world too mysterious to fully grasp, and too gentle to rush through. You breathe out. The lodestone doesn't move, but it doesn't need to. You drift now, deeper into the olive-scented dreamscape of ancient Greece, where the stars above shimmer not just with light, but with meaning. Somewhere behind you, the philosophical whispers continue, softer now, like waves retreating from the shore. You're reclining beside a lazy fountain, its babble mingling with the chirps of unseen night insects. And overhead, the sky itself seems to breathe. This isn't poetic fancy. You're listening to Anaximenes, a pre-Socratic philosopher who thought breath, pneuma, was everything. Not just what fills your lungs, but what fills the cosmos. Air was the divine principle, invisible, ever-present, essential. And if you're following that line of thought with half-lidded eyes, then yes, magnetism must be breath too. A kind of gentle inhalation, a pull from within. You pick up the lodestone again, feel its silent tug on a nearby pin. According to Anaximenes, this rock moves not because it's alive in the usual sense, but because it breathes, the same way you do, the same way the world does. The magnet is part of the great exhale of existence. There's a certain sleepy beauty in that idea, that the entire universe is slowly breathing in and out, and sometimes it tugs a little harder. Let's slide in a mainstream fact here. The Earth's magnetic field is actually generated by liquid iron flowing in its outer core, creating electric currents. These currents, in turn, generate a field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space. You are quite literally living inside a planetary force field. Think about that as you roll over and shift your pillow. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. In some old folk traditions, people believed you could catch the magnetic breath by sleeping with a lodestone under your pillow. They thought it would align your thoughts, your soul, your dreams. You try it now, placing the stone near your head. Nothing happens, but your dreams suddenly feel slightly more metallic. Scientists still argue whether magnetoreception, how animals sense Earth's magnetic field, is entirely based on magnetite or if there's another quantum-level mechanism at play. Cryptochrome proteins, radical pair reactions, tiny dances in the dark, it's all still hazy, hidden in layers of mystery. But back in your Greek reverie, the idea is simpler. You imagine the magnet pulling not just iron, but ether, the invisible soul stuff that glues reality together. It's not moving the nail, they might say. It's calling to it, inviting it to breathe together. You pause for a moment, wondering how it would feel to see every object this way. Your coffee mug, a vessel of minor spirit, your socks, low-sole fabric, perhaps, your smartphone. Overstimulated, definitely, but probably brimming with confused little techno-souls trying to update themselves. You blink slowly. The fountain trickles on. You stretch out your legs and remember that to ancient Greeks, air wasn't empty. It wasn't nothing. It was the substrate of everything. You swam in it the way fish swim in water. It carried voices, smells, and yes, souls. It held magnetism the way the sea holds salt, invisibly but essentially. Even now, physicists describe fields as things that permeate space. The magnetic field isn't on or off. It's there, always waiting for something to respond. Lodestones just happen to respond particularly well. They breathe it in. They exhale alignment. And you, half asleep and halfway between dreams, begin to believe it too. There's something funny about how we explain things, isn't there? You go from "it has a soul" to "it has a field." And really, both are just metaphors wearing different hats. One hat is made of marble and olive branches, the other lab goggles and spreadsheets. But the mystery remains. You close your eyes and imagine yourself floating. The earth below is glowing faintly with its magnetic pulse, like a sleeping creature breathing steadily. And all around it, tiny lodestones hum in harmony, vibrating ever so gently with the rhythm of that cosmic breath. Anaximenes would be proud. You're no longer just a person with a rock. You're a being suspended in the slow respiration of the universe. Every object breathing, pulling, aligning. Every force a sigh. Every stone a sleeper. You open your eyes one last time and glance at the lodestone, now resting beside a folded linen cloth. It doesn't move, but you almost expect it to, and not from some inner motor, but from something more delicate, a soft breath, a soul-shaped whisper saying, "I'm still here, and so are you." The sky above you is darker now, almost entirely navy, speckled with stars that pulse like slow heartbeats. You're reclining against a stone column warmed by the day's sun, and in your hand, the lodestone has begun to feel less like a rock and more like a companion, A sleepy, unblinking friend that doesn't talk much but pulls a little harder when you try to put it down. Tonight, your thoughts begin to swirl around motion, not just movement, but purpose. Why does the compass needle spin? Why does it turn to face north, even in complete silence? The ancient Greeks didn't have compasses, of course. That wouldn't come until much later from China. But they did see how the lodestone moved iron. And from that, they began to wonder if maybe all movement was divine. You watch the flicker of an oil lamp nearby, the flame bending just slightly as if drawn by some unseen force, and then you picture an invisible hand nudging things into alignment. The magnet moves the iron not through collision or push, but by suggestion. It invites, and the iron obeys. Some philosophers believe this was evidence of divine will, that magnets were proof of the gods leaving fingerprints on reality. No strings, no gears, just action through will. You sit with that thought for a while, letting it settle into your chest like a lullaby. Here's a mainstream fact to keep the sleepy science grounded. Magnetic fields exert force on moving charges. That's the basis of how electric motors work. A coil of wire, a magnet, some electrons zipping along. Suddenly, you've got motion. It's precise, predictable, and yet still kind of weird. The magnet moves the electrons, but not by touching them. It nudges them across space, the way a song might shift your mood. Now the quirky bit. In some medieval texts, people describe magnets as dancers. Not metaphorically, literally. They imagine tiny spirits inside the stones performing choreographed movements that caused iron to follow. It wasn't just science. It was theater, a magnetic ballet. And the open debate? Scientists still argue whether magnetism is a fundamental force on its own or a side effect of deeper quantum symmetries. The more they discover, the more magnetism feels like the rabbit hole that never ends, just keeps bending space, flipping spins, and rewriting the rules of attraction. You picture a philosopher watching a compass needle spin for the first time, long before compasses existed. Maybe they hung a sliver of lodestone from a silk thread and watched it wobble, slowly, lazily, then settle, always the same direction. That motion, so smooth, so consistent, must have felt like communication, like the stone was responding to something higher. Was it the breath of the gods, the heartbeat of the earth, or something stranger whispering through space? You blink slowly, half lost in that thought, and imagine a world where every object that moves is doing so because it wants to. Not just pulled, but compelled. Every spin a message, every twitch a desire, like iron filings performing a slow-motion dance across the table. Not because of pressure, but because of yearning. It sounds romantic until you realize it's not so far from modern science. Magnets don't push or pull through direct contact, they act across a field. The movement is invisible, intangible, almost dreamlike. It might as well be divine choreography. And if you zoom out far enough, if you float high above the earth, you can picture it, 1,000 tiny magnets, each one whispering across the void, saying, "Come closer, turn here, spin just so," like fireflies pulsing in sync, like a language made of motion. The philosophers would sit for hours with their lodestones, watching them do what no other stones could. And they began to draw conclusions not just about magnetism, but about the structure of reality itself. If motion could occur without touch, then surely will was everywhere. You roll the lodestone between your fingers now, eyes fluttering at half-mast, and imagine that it has preferences. Maybe it likes one direction better. Maybe it spins a little slower on rainy nights. Maybe it sighs quietly when left alone. You glance toward the oil lamp again. Its flame is smaller now, flickering in rhythm with your breath. Or maybe with the magnets. Hard to tell at this point. And you realize something. For all our advances, for all the textbooks and formulas and magnetic levitation trains, we still talk about magnets with a kind of reverence. We still call it attraction. We still describe their fields as if they were territory. We still act like they choose. You nestle deeper into your spot beside the column, the cool stone behind you and the quiet warmth of the lodestone in your palm. It hasn't moved, but it doesn't have to. It's already set the scene, moved the iron, directed the spin. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you find comfort in the thought that maybe, just maybe, you're being moved too. Not with force, not with pressure, but with purpose, with something soft and slow and ancient, like divine will or just the sleepiness of science. The cicadas have faded now. The air has cooled. You lie on your side beneath a fig tree, eyes half closed, watching the lodestone as it sits in the grass beside you, utterly still and yet somehow not lifeless. And in this drowsy quiet, a peculiar idea from ancient thinkers begins to emerge. A theory so charmingly strange, you can't help but smile. They thought magnets were hungry. That's right. The lodestone, in its mysterious iron-pulling power, wasn't just acting on soul or breath, it was eating. The attraction of iron was seen as a kind of appetite, a cosmic craving. When a shard of iron leapt toward the stone, philosophers said it was being consumed. You're not sure whether to laugh or take it seriously, but here, in the flickering candlelight of pre-modern thought, everything was fair game. If it moves, it must want something, they'd say, and magnets, it seemed, wanted iron. You gently toss a paperclip onto the grass and place the lodestone beside it. It pulls, just slightly, dragging the metal shard a few millimeters across the ground. You watch as if the stone were nibbling, tasting, sampling the edge of the clip like a snail at a leaf. Let's ground this midnight metaphor with a real scientific bite. In physics, what we call magnetic attraction is caused by aligned electron spins creating a magnetic domain. When an object like iron enters that domain, it's pulled toward the lowest energy position, where it's most stable, most at rest. It's not wanting exactly, but to the human brain, it sure looks like it. And here's the quirky historical tidbit. In some writings, ancient philosophers described the lodestone's behavior in terms used for organisms. They said it feeds, gathers, consumes. Some even wondered whether magnets grew stronger the more iron they touched, like they were gaining weight. Scientists today still argue whether magnetic saturation, the point where a material can't be magnetized any further, is a surface-level phenomenon or one that's fundamentally tied to atomic limits. The stone might not be digesting iron, but it definitely has a limit, a kind of fullness. You roll over slightly and imagine a little scene, a banquet table. At its center, a lodestone wearing a tiny toga, delicately sampling spoons of iron filings like caviar. "No more, please," it says. "I'm magnetically full." It's a ridiculous image, but it's also kind of perfect, because in the absence of microscopes, sensors, or particle physics, the ancient mind did what it had to. It personified. If a thing behaved like a living creature, then maybe it was one. If it moved toward iron, it must be craving it. If it got weaker over time, maybe it was aging. You glance at the paperclip again, now firmly attached to the stone. The lodestone doesn't chew, obviously, but it's satisfied. The attraction has settled. The hunger, real or imagined, is sated. And so is yours. Because there's something deeply restful about this idea. That nature, in all its strangeness, is acting out a slow, graceful drama of desire and fulfillment. Stones reaching, iron answering, motions driven not by math, but by metaphor. A universe where every object wants something simple, something magnetic. You close your eyes, drifting further into that world, and wonder, if magnets are hungry, what else might be? Does gravity crave mass? Does light yearn for a path? Do clouds sigh when they finally rain? You're smiling now, not because you believe it, but because you want to. Because in this moment you realize that sleep itself is a kind of pull, a field, a desire. You're being drawn not by force, but by softness, by a low, invisible hum that says, rest, settle, come closer. Like iron to lodestone. You're lying flatter now, the ground beneath you warm from the lingering sun, your breath slow and even. Somewhere nearby, the lodestone rests, no longer just a stone, but a kind of ancient roommate. And tonight, you slip deeper, not just into sleep, but into ideas. Big ones. You float now through the airy halls of Plato's Academy, surrounded by chalky figures in robes and sandals, all speaking in low, deliberate tones. In this world, everything is built from shapes. Everything real has a perfect form, including, somehow, magnets. You squint a little, adjusting to the light in this abstract world. Imagine that the universe isn't made of atoms, but of geometry. Plato believed reality was just a pale shadow of some perfect, unchanging world of forms. A circle to him wasn't just a shape, it was an eternal truth. A triangle, divine logic, a magnetic field, maybe not understood in his day, but if he'd seen one, he'd have likely filed it under living geometry. And here's where it gets interesting. Plato had this idea that the universe is animated, not by accident or randomness, but by purpose, a kind of cosmic soul that steers everything. So when a lodestone pulls a sliver of iron, it's not just a rock doing a trick, it's a reminder that forms have power, that invisible forces might be the most real things of all. You picture a chalk diagram on a stone wall, concentric circles, vector arrows, someone scribbling desire monk motion in ancient Greek shorthand. And there's your lodestone again, not just a rock, but a participant in the great dance of aligned intention. Here's a grounded mainstream bite. Plato's student Aristotle would eventually disagree, but Plato himself leaned heavily into the idea that all motion required a soul. The heavens spun not because of gravity, but because they wanted to spin. It's like saying the moon orbits because it finds joy in circles. Adorably wrong? Maybe, but weirdly comforting. Quirky historical tidbit? Some Neoplatonists, later followers of Plato, actually believed that geometry itself could heal. They made amulets shaped like magnetic fields and charged them with intention, hoping they'd realign the body's inner harmony. Think of it as ancient magnetic therapy with triangles. And scientists today, they still argue whether consciousness emerges from complex systems or whether it's somehow embedded in the fabric of reality. That idea, that soul or awareness might be a fundamental property, echoes old Platonic dreams in surprising ways. You picture the lodestone again, now reframed not as a creature or a hunger machine, but as a perfectly shaped gear in a much larger clock. Its pull is part of a system. It responds because it is aligned, not just with iron, but with form, with purpose. You imagine Plato standing in front of a classroom, holding up a lodestone, saying, "This, my students, is not a rock. It is a window. a window into invisible truths, into the hidden structure of the cosmos. You nod sleepily, though your head might be resting on your arm at this point, because maybe that's what magnets always were, a peek behind the curtain, a little nudge that says, there's more to this than meets the eye, more than mass, more than motion, something deeper, something shaped. You blink slowly and look around. The academy dissolves, the voices fade. You're back beneath your fig tree. Your lodestone sits still. You place it near a small nail you found earlier, and once again, it moves, just a little, just enough to whisper, geometry lives here. There's something beautifully boring about that. A stone, behaving exactly the way it always has, doing the same thing it did 3,000 years ago. Quietly, consistently, magnetically. You roll over slightly, letting your shoulder settle into the earth, and you think, what if the Greeks weren't wrong? Not entirely. What if everything does follow a hidden shape, a secret blueprint? What if magnets pull not because of force, but because of alignment? Because they're acting out a role in a pattern older than thought? And with that thought, you breathe in deeply, letting your lungs fill with night air. You're not just lying on the earth anymore. You're part of it, connected to a planet-sized system, a slow, mathematical symphony of motion, form, and pull. Like Plato said, the world has a soul, and tonight it dreams in straight lines, slow curves, and magnetic fields. You stir slightly, shifting beneath the fig tree as a breeze brushes your cheek. The lodestone, still resting nearby, is unmoved, but not forgotten. Its quiet pull remains, like a single cello note holding firm beneath an orchestra of ancient ideas. And now you find yourself drifting into the mind of Aristotle. He arrives with sandals too clean and a brow too furrowed. The kind of man who didn't love mysteries. He loved answers, precise, labeled, sorted into categories, preferably in Latin. Where Plato imagined ideal forms, Aristotle focused on causes. If something moved, it wasn't because of desire or geometry. It was because of one of his four neat little boxes: material, formal, efficient, or final cause. Nothing moved without a reason. Nothing. So you can imagine how annoyed he must have been with the lodestone. You sit beside him now, on a dusty stone bench in Athens, watching him try to explain magnetism with a stick and a handful of iron filings. This stone attracts the filings, he mutters, but it does not have a soul. Stones are not animals. He pauses, then frowns. Unless they are oddly spirited animals. See, Aristotle wanted to be done with all this soul nonsense. He had defined the soul as the form of a living thing, something with growth, perception, or movement under its own power. A rock? Nope. No eyes, no tummy, no heartbeat. But the lodestone kept breaking the rules. Here's your scientific anchor for this part. Magnetism is a non-contact force. It doesn't push, it doesn't pull like a rope. It acts across space, invisible, immediate. That alone would have driven Aristotle slightly mad, because he liked things to be visible, logical, and preferably within arm's reach. So he tried. He said the lodestone was not alive, but its action was a kind of natural motion. Iron had an affinity for the lodestone. Sort of like how smoke naturally rises or a rock naturally falls. These motions weren't chosen. They were just what things did. But deep down, you suspect even Aristotle wasn't satisfied with that. Because when you watch a magnetic piece of iron leap across a small distance toward a stone, it feels alive. It doesn't look like natural motion. It looks like desire. That's where things get awkward. Even today, scientists still argue whether attraction at the quantum level, like entangled particles, can be considered a kind of proto-awareness. Not consciousness exactly, but preference. It's controversial, it's murky. It would probably make Aristotle roll his eyes so hard they'd fall out. Now for your quirky fringe tidbit. A few centuries after Aristotle, some of his followers began to believe that magnets work because of hidden vapors. Seriously, they thought the stone exhaled invisible magnet breath that reached out and grabbed iron. Aristotle wouldn't have loved that, but hey, it beats tiny spirits with spoons. You sit quietly now, watching Aristotle scratch notes into wax tablets, still muttering about natural tendencies and elemental sympathy. You can almost hear the tension in his voice. He wants to believe everything has a clean cause, but the lodestone just pulls. It doesn't fit. And you're sort of fine with that. You lie back down and stare at the sky, where a few constellations start to peek through the dusk. Orion's belt, the Little Dipper, all magnets in a way, guiding, aligning, pulling. Maybe the magnet doesn't need a soul to be special. Maybe the real soul is in the way we keep returning to it, trying to explain it, arguing over it across millennia. There's a strange kind of sentience in attention, isn't there? If we never stop thinking about something, doesn't that give it a little life? You open one eye toward the lodestone, still resting quietly in the grass. No breath, no heartbeat, but plenty of motion. You place another paperclip nearby and watch, not surprised this time, as it slides slowly across the dirt to meet its companion. A soft sigh escapes you. Aristotle was brilliant, but maybe he was also a little too tidy. Life, like magnetism, is messy, mysterious, not always easy to label. So tonight, as the air cools and the sky turns to velvet, you make peace with contradiction. The lodestone doesn't need to have a soul, but if pretending it does helps you sleep better, well, maybe that's cause enough. The night grows thicker, like ink pooling across parchment. You're half curled beneath the fig tree now, arms folded, one leg stretched lazily over the other. The lodestone rests in the soft dirt beside you, quiet as ever. Yet somehow, the more you look at it, the more involved it seems. As if it's not just sitting there, but waiting. And tonight, you're ready to follow a different line of thought. Not about single stones pulling iron, but about chains. Yes, you heard that right. Some ancient thinkers believed that magnetism could travel through a chain of objects, not by contact or pressure, but by the mysterious transmission of soul force. You imagine the scene. A philosopher places a lodestone on the table, then lines up several iron rings behind it. Nothing touches, yet each ring begins to sway, then cling to the next. The pull is passed along, link by link, like gossip at a dinner party. You shift a little on your elbow, eyelids fluttering, and picture the phrase they used. Sympatheia, a sort of deep cosmic sympathy, a principle that said all things in nature were connected. What happened to one could affect another, even at a distance. And magnets? They were the proof. Here's your mainstream scientific note. Magnetic fields do extend through space. A magnetic material like iron becomes temporarily magnetized in the presence of a strong magnetic field, essentially aligning its internal electrons to match the source. That's why you can chain nails together beneath a magnet, and they all pull in the same direction. Modern science calls it magnetic induction, but in the ancient mind, that wasn't just physics, it was spiritual inheritance. The magnet passed on its essence, its breath, its miniature soul. You now imagine a scene from a sleepy old lecture hall, a philosopher slowly waving his hand above the chain rings, saying each carries the spirit of the one before it. You glance at the lodestone beside you. Is it passing something on? Is your paperclip now just a little more magnetic or a little more alive? Time for a fringe tidbit. In some early writings, philosophers proposed that magnetic chains worked best during specific moon phases. The idea was that the moon's own mysterious powers amplified the magnetic breath, linking all things in harmony. So for optimal magnetic soul transmission, one was advised to wait for a full moon, speak a brief incantation, and make sure no toads were nearby. Naturally. And scientists today? Still arguing, especially over questions like how magnetic information is preserved in long geological samples or whether entangled particles influence one another across time. Some even wonder if quantum field fluctuations are carried across chains of interaction, like a very spooky version of magnetic telephone. But let's come back to your moment now. You're nearly asleep, and the concept of a soul chain isn't just interesting, it's cozy. You roll onto your back and stare up at the branches above you, the stars peeking through like silver eyes, and you think, what if all things really are linked? What if every action echoes forward? What if magnetism is just the physical version of empathy? You reach for the lodestone, then gently press it against your wrist. No real change. But part of you wonders, has it passed something on? A whisper of energy? A thread of force? A little magnetic signature that says we were here together? You sigh and close your eyes again. In this ancient Greek world of slow logic and long shadows, the magnetic chain becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a metaphor, a reminder that forces travel, that energy lingers, that sometimes we are not pulled directly, but by someone else who was pulled before us. And that's something to sleep on. You drift now, deeper into the chain of thoughts, half dreaming of magnetic stones passing invisible notes across the ages, each one telling the next, stay aligned, stay connected, stay kind. Even if you don't feel it, even if you don't know it, even if it takes all night. The moon is high now, casting silver across the grass like a lazy spilled potion. You're lying perfectly still, somewhere between a philosopher and a napping cat, your hand resting gently on the cool surface of the lodestone. The quiet hum of ancient thought still floats around you, faint but persistent, like a forgotten melody. And tonight, we float straight into one of the stranger ideas to haunt the minds of old thinkers. Ether. No, not the stuff your great-great-uncle might have inhaled before surgery. We're talking about the mysterious fifth element, the invisible substance believed to fill the gaps between all things: air, fire, water, earth, and then, beyond them all, ether, the divine glue, the silk wrapping of the cosmos, the soul stuff of everything. You picture yourself wading through it now, a smooth, weightless ocean that presses on nothing, yet carries all. The Greeks believed this ether was the medium through which stars moved, dreams traveled, and yes, magnetism flowed. So when a lodestone pulled iron from across the table, it wasn't doing anything weird. It was just stirring the ether, like dipping your finger into water and watching a paper boat float toward it. The ether carried the motion, passed the soul along, wrapped around invisible fields like a second skin. You blink slowly. That image makes more sense the sleepier you get. And here's the scientific twist. Even centuries later, scientists were still trying to prove ether was real. It wasn't just a Greek bedtime story. It was mainstream science until the late 1800s. For centuries, everyone believed light needed a medium to travel through, And the luminiferous ether was their best guess. It was everywhere, nowhere, undetectable, but surely there. Until a certain pair of fellows, Michelson and Morley, ran a very precise experiment in 1887 and found nothing. No ether wind, no difference in light speed, just empty space. The universe apparently did not require a divine ocean to get things moving. Still, scientists today continue to argue, though now it's over different invisibles, like quantum vacuum energy, or dark matter, or whether space is really empty at all. One mystery dissolves and 10 more peek through the curtain. Back to your fringe tidbit. In some esoteric traditions, ether was not just a medium, it was considered alive, a field of awareness, a kind of universal mind. And magnets? They were breathers of ether. Think of them as nostrils of the cosmos, gently inhaling and exhaling the energy that binds everything. You giggle a little at the idea, or maybe you just exhale a snore. A magnet as a nostril? That's a tough mental image, but it's oddly relaxing. You imagine your lodestone rising and falling with a slow, invisible breath. Inhale, attraction. Exhale, alignment. There's something wonderfully sleepy about ether. It asks nothing. It proves nothing. It just is. Like a lullaby that doesn't need lyrics. It surrounds you, holds you, and allows the weird to happen. It's why a magnet can pull, why stars can glide, why dreams can wander. You reach up now and trace a shape in the air above you, a slow spiral. Maybe that's the motion of ether. Maybe that's how soul moves when it doesn't want to hurry. The Greeks imagined the heavens made of ether too, so perfect and divine that it could only exist where gods walked. Earth was messy, ether was elegant, and magnetism, it was the one earthly thing that hinted at divine elegance. No friction, no contact, just grace. You let your arm fall back to the ground, a slight crunch of dry grass, and you wonder, what if we miss ether? What if, in our drive to explain everything, we let go of one of the most comforting ideas, that something unseeable connects us all? Not a signal, not a force, not a field, just a softness, a space where things find one another. You drift now, not through theories, but through that imagined substance. You're floating in ether, cradled, weightless, motionless, yet being moved in ways you can't quite feel. And somewhere nearby, your lodestone hums its silent pull. It doesn't need to prove anything, it just is. The way breath is, the way sleep is, the way mystery always was. You don't know when it happened, sometime between the last exhale and the shift of your fingers, but now you're drifting, not dreaming, not waking, just somewhere in between. The fig tree above you rustles gently. The grass cradles your back like an old friend, and the lodestone rests beside you, steady and still. Tonight, your thoughts take a stranger turn into one of the most peculiar corners of magnetic belief, awareness. Yes, awareness, a whisper of consciousness. Not quite intelligence, but something like it. Some ancient thinkers, especially as Greek ideas filtered into the early medieval and mystical worlds, suggested that magnets didn't just move things, they knew where those things were. They responded, reacted, adjusted. You imagine a lodestone sitting on a table. A sliver of iron lies nearby. The stone pulls, but only once the iron is close enough. Ah, they might have said, it waits until it senses. It knows. You shift slightly, arm beneath your head, and let that thought swirl. Can a rock know anything? Of course not. But then again, isn't response a kind of awareness? When something behaves differently based on its environment, aren't we tempted to call that intention? Here's your scientific breadcrumb for this part. Magnetism is spatially dependent. A magnetic field weakens with distance, and materials only respond once within a threshold of influence. This isn't awareness, just physics, a smooth decay of force across space. But to the ancient mind, that delay felt personal. They imagined the magnet as a sort of sleepy guardian, dozing until something worthy came close enough to rouse it. The iron was the alarm clock, the lodestone, the patient listener. And here's your historical fringe tidbit. In early Arabic texts and Renaissance writings, magnets were sometimes described as sleepwalkers. That's right, stones that acted without knowing, moved with purpose but no memory, a kind of automatic motion, a mysterious instinct. You stretch your legs, toes pointing toward the stars, and you think, aren't we all a little like that sometimes? Going through the motions, pulled by things we can't explain, drawn toward places we didn't plan to go. Scientists still argue whether certain chemical reactions in biology show rudimentary forms of directionality. Some debate whether self-organization at the cellular level could count as proto-cognition. That's a fancy way of asking, when a system responds consistently and adaptively, is that intelligence or just structure? You look at the lodestone now and see not a mind, but maybe a message, a tiny reminder that the universe doesn't always have to shout. Sometimes it just leans, gently, repeatedly, until something moves. And maybe that's what made the ancient world so hypnotic. Their explanations weren't exact, but they were intimate. They looked at a stone that pulled without pushing, and they saw purpose. They didn't ask, what causes this? They asked, what does it mean that this happens at all? You close your eyes, the breeze tickling the back of your neck. Your thoughts swirl gently now, no longer rushing toward answers. You imagine being a lodestone, quiet, still, unmoving, until the right presence comes near. And then, without thinking, you act. You attract. You respond. Not because you decide to, because you are made to. You smile softly. That's not so different from life, is it? You think of how people drift into each other's orbits, how thoughts respond to moods, how gravity and grief can both pull without touch. The lodestone is a reminder that not all force is forceful, that sometimes the deepest actions are invisible, silent, sleepwalking. And as your body sinks deeper into the night, you begin to feel like part of the pattern, not just a person lying under a tree, but an object responding to a quiet field you'll never quite see, pulled by rest, attracted by stillness. Not with awareness, but with grace. The stars above you blink slowly now, like they're getting tired themselves. The night is deep and still, and your breaths are longer, softer, barely stirring the air. The lodestone, your quiet little companion, rests near your hand. But tonight, its ancient, mysterious pull takes on an entirely new role. Because, believe it or not, magnets weren't just for philosophy. They were once used in magic. Not the wand-waving, spellbook-flipping kind. Though, let's be honest, a lodestone does look like something you'd find in a wizard's pocket. No, we're talking about love spells, potions, charms, the kind whispered under moonlight and crushed into powders by candlelight. You sit up just a little, only in your mind really, and picture a Greco-Roman healer grinding a lodestone with rose petals and honey, mixing it into a salve meant to make someone irresistible. The idea that the magnet's power to attract iron could be transferred to the person who wore or consumed it. Attraction by association. Now that's branding. In some traditions, powdered lodestone was blended into oils and rubbed into the skin, or hidden in pouches sewn into clothing. People believed it could pull affections, mend broken hearts, or draw back wandering lovers. Ancient tinder, with less ghosting and more actual ghosts. Here's your mainstream science snack. While ingesting powdered magnetite is not recommended, seriously, don't do that. Iron is, in fact, an essential mineral for the human body, so technically you are already magnetic in a small way. Your blood contains iron, and iron responds to strong enough magnetic fields, though not quite in the soul-binding way those old texts hoped for. Quirky tidbit of the night? There were documented rituals, some as late as the 1600s, where people whispered the name of a desired lover while heating a lodestone over fire, believing the heat would ignite the connection. The hotter the stone, the stronger the spell. One guide even suggested placing the magnet under your bed, so your dreams could do the seducing for you. Sleepwalking attraction, you might say. And scientists today? They don't debate love spells, but they do argue over magnetic therapy. Some claim magnets help with pain or circulation. Others say it's placebo. The magnetic fields are usually too weak to penetrate deeply, but that doesn't stop a multi-billion-dollar industry from selling bracelets, pillows, and mattress pads that promise a better night's sleep through magnetic balance. You run your fingers over the lodestone and wonder, what is it about magnets that feels like longing? Is it the way they act from afar? Is it the way they wait unmoving until something responds? Or maybe it's the simplicity. They attract or they don't. They're not pushy, they don't chase, they just exist patiently until something finds them. And in a way, isn't that what love is? Quiet presence, consistent pull, no pressure, just potential. You lie back again, watching the stars swirl ever so slightly. You think about all the people across centuries who looked at this same kind of stone and thought, maybe this can help me find someone. Maybe this rock understands what it means to want. And even if that's silly, even if you know that magnetic fields don't care about your dating life, it's oddly comforting because it means you're part of a very long, very human story. A story of wanting, waiting, hoping, of quietly pulling towards something unseen. You glance at the lodestone again, still unmoved, still magnetic, still keeping secrets. And tonight, maybe that's enough. You don't need it to work. You just need it to remind you that even in stillness, there can be connection. Even in silence, there can be longing. Even in sleep, there can be pull. So you close your eyes, surrounded by invisible fields of gravity, of air, of thought, of memory. And somewhere in all of that, maybe just a whisper of magnetic love. You're deeper now, not just in thought, but in something gentler. Your limbs are heavy, your mind like a stone slowly sinking in a still pond. And in this near sleep, the lodestone beside you shifts again, not in position, but in meaning. Because tonight, it becomes something more than a symbol of attraction. It becomes a tool of alchemy. In alchemy, the art of transformation, the dream of turning lead into gold, of distilling immortality from salt, of revealing the divine in the mundane. And in that strange, shimmering world of robed scholars and bubbling flasks, magnets weren't just rocks. They were guides, teachers, evidence that matter could desire to become something better. You wander now through an imagined alchemist's laboratory, cluttered, shadowy, scented with sulfur and roses. An old man stirs a thick black mixture in a crucible while whispering to himself about planetary metals and the music of spheres. On his shelf, a lodestone, wrapped in cloth, labeled carefully, reverently. He doesn't use it to attract iron, but to attract truth. You see, in alchemy, every metal had a spirit. Lead was heavy with sorrow. Silver was reflective as pure. Gold, the perfection of matter, was luminous, incorruptible, divine. And the lodestone? It was special. It had motion. It showed desire. It moved things without being touched. To the alchemist, that was no small thing. Here's your grounded fact for this late hour. Magnetite, lodestone, is one of the only naturally occurring magnets on Earth. It's not made in a lab. It forms on its own, deep in the crust, aligning its atoms just right through geological forces. That alone is a kind of magic. And the quirky fringe detail? Some alchemists believe magnets could be used to purify other metals, drawing out the impurities, realigning their inner essence. They even tried suspending gold in magnetic fields, hoping it would absorb the lodestone's invisible order, a spiritual exfoliation, if you will. Modern scientists still argue about strange phenomena like magnetically assisted crystallization. Under certain conditions, magnetic fields do influence the way atoms form crystals, faster, sharper, more orderly. The field itself doesn't touch the matter, but it changes it all the same. You yawn, feeling your own atoms rearrange into sleepier versions of themselves. You picture your body not as a whole, but as billions of tiny particles, dancing, aligning, shifting slowly towards something more settled. The alchemist believed that everything sought perfection, that even metals had goals, that the lodestone in pulling iron toward it was not just a force, but a metaphor, a reminder that transformation is possible, that we are all in some way becoming gold. You glance at the lodestone in the grass. It hasn't moved, but it's working. Because maybe the most powerful transformations are the invisible ones, the small magnetic shifts inside us when we pause, reflect, soften. The parts of us that lean, without knowing why, towards something we think might be better. The alchemist, back in his workshop, would call that purification, the soul-shedding dross, the base-turning noble. You might just call it rest. You close your eyes again and think about how quiet change can be, like iron dust slowly forming a pattern, like thoughts aligning when you stop trying to force them, like a magnet under paper showing shape where there was once only chaos. And in that stillness, you begin to believe it's true. The lodestone doesn't just attract, it organizes. It invites matter to remember its form. It whispers, this way, not loudly, not harshly, but consistently, gently, like a bedtime story written in the language of Pull. So tonight, let yourself align with silence, with stillness, with whatever sleepy perfection awaits just beyond the next breath. You don't need gold. You just need gravity and breath, and maybe a little magnetism to keep you turning the right way. You're still now, barely a shift in the grass, your breath soft as thread. The lodestone lies close, a tiny relic of 1,000 thoughts. And in the dim folds of your half-dream, the world grows medieval. You're in a candlelit room filled with scrolls and dust, where robes drag across wooden floors and minds bend toward ancient Greek echoes. It's the Middle Ages, and after a long nap, magnetism is waking up again. Monks in stone libraries, scholars hunched over Latin translations of Aristotle and Galen, and right there, nestled between metaphysics and medicine, is your friend, the lodestone. The old questions return. Does it have soul? Is its force natural or divine? Can it be trusted? The scholars debate, their voices low and rhythmic, like prayers whispered beneath stained glass. The rediscovery of magnetism brings both awe and suspicion. You picture one of these thinkers, maybe in Paris, maybe in Baghdad, holding a lodestone with delicate fingertips, watching it tug a needle across the surface of a bowl. He writes in his notebook, "It moves, but why?" Let's bring in your scientific tether for this stretch. In the medieval period, thinkers began trying to test and quantify magnetism. They observed that if you suspended a magnetized needle, it would always point in the same direction, north. This was the seed of the compass, a quiet revolution. But before it became an instrument of navigation, the compass was a philosophical problem. Scholars wondered, is the needle pointing to heaven? Is the force angelic? Does the earth have a soul? And here's your fringe detail. In the 13th century, a scholar named Peter Peregrinus of Maricourt wrote one of the first serious treatises on magnets. He called magnetism a hidden virtue, a secret power placed in the earth by God. He drew diagrams of spheres and forces, and some say he believed the earth itself was a giant lodestone. You roll over slightly, tucking one hand beneath your cheek. That idea that the planet is a magnet still holds. Scientists today confirm it. Earth's core generates a geomagnetic field. It protects us from solar radiation. It guides birds across continents. And it whispers gently to every compass needle, even now, even in your drawer. But medieval thinkers weren't just interested in navigation. They were still obsessed with meaning. What did it say about the world? That this tiny stone could move something without touching it? Could it be used to reveal moral truth? Could it guide not just ships, but hearts? Some monks believed magnets could diagnose illness. Others thought magnetic attraction mirrored divine love, persistent, invisible, irresistible. You smile at that. Even in the middle of plagues and wars, people still found time to believe in metaphors. And scientists still argue today over metaphorical frameworks in physics. Is a magnetic field best visualized as lines, as a quantum exchange, as a perturbation of space-time? None are real. They're just ways to describe the pull. The mystery remains. You imagine yourself walking through a monastery courtyard now, trailing your fingers across cold stone, feeling the weight of centuries of thought. In a quiet corner, a friar dips a magnet into iron filings and watches them cling. He thinks, so the world responds to touchless power. Perhaps so do we. You glance at your lodestone again. No sparks, no drama, but undeniable influence. A pull you can't see, a change you can't stop. And that's what the Middle Ages brought back into focus. Not just curiosity, but faith in ideas, in forces, in the possibility that the invisible might shape the visible. That soul, perhaps, wasn't so different from magnetism after all. You close your eyes again, just for a moment. You hear the scratch of a feathered quill, the turn of parchment, a distant bell. The lodestone waits beside you, just as it did beside them. The world keeps pulling, and we keep wondering. The hours are melting now, like wax from an old monastery candle. The air is thick with stillness, and your body has nearly forgotten how to move. The fig tree no longer rustles. It simply exists, like you, in deep quiet. And beside you, the lodestone lies unchanged. But its story is approaching a shift. Because now you leave behind the soul-filled theories, the whispers of spirits and sleeping stones. Tonight you begin the slow turn from soul to science. You drift into a colder, brighter world. The Renaissance is ending, the Enlightenment cracking its knuckles, and the old mystical voices begin to fade beneath the rising clatter of tools, measurements, and equations. Lodestones, once magical, are becoming instruments. You picture yourself in a study filled with brass and glass. A scientist, maybe William Gilbert, The court physician to Queen Elizabeth I leans over a globe made of lodestone. He spins it slowly and calls it Terrella, or Little Earth. To him, this isn't just a rock, it's a model, a miniature, magnetized planet. Gilbert writes that the Earth itself is a giant magnet, and that's why compasses work. He banishes the idea of lodestones having souls. It is not because of appetite or awareness, he declares. It is because of nature. The field is real, the pull is predictable, and soul, that's for poets. Here's your science check-in. Gilbert was right. In 1600, he correctly theorized that the Earth has magnetic poles and that this field causes compass needles to align. His work marked the beginning of the modern scientific understanding of magnetism, based on observation, not mysticism. But even in this new rational world, magnetism remains slippery. Newton would soon describe gravity as an invisible force too, acting at a distance, unexplained. And while scientists pushed away spiritual explanations, they kept using the same words: attraction, repulsion, influence. The soul was gone, but the language stayed haunted. Now, for your quirky tidbit, during the 1700s, some European thinkers believed magnets could be used to cure diseases, not because of their soul, but because of their alignment with the body's magnetic fluids. This theory evolved into animal magnetism, championed by Franz Mesmer. Yes, that Mesmer, the one whose name gave us mesmerize. Mesmer claimed invisible magnetic forces could be manipulated to heal emotional and physical imbalances. He moved iron rods over people's bodies, performed dramatic passes with his hands, and sent them into trances. His work was later dismissed as theatrical quackery, but in many ways it was a bridge between the ancient and the modern, between magic and medicine. And even now, scientists still argue about certain magnetic effects in biology. Not Mesmer's theatrics, but things like magnetoreception in animals, or the faint influence of magnetic fields on enzyme reactions, or the emerging field of magnetogenetics, where magnetic fields are used to influence neurons. Yes, really. So the soul is gone, but the questions remain. You stretch just slightly, barely enough to rustle the grass, and think, maybe the stone doesn't need to have a soul to do something profound. Maybe what matters is that it makes you feel something. It was never about the lodestone pulling iron. It was about it pulling thought, attention, wonder. Even as science advanced, even as magnets were used in motors and meters and machines, people kept a soft spot for them. They held on to them, played with them, gave them as gifts, slid them across tables in quiet fascination. We love magnets not just because they're useful, but because they still feel strange. You glance again at your own stone. It hasn't changed, but the world around it has. And you, somewhere between awake and asleep, can feel both timelines humming, the old and the new, the soul and the field. Gilbert's hand spins the Torella. Mesmer waves his arms. And you breathe. The air feels heavier now, not in a bad way, just slower, like gravity has turned down the lights. The lodestone beside you doesn't move, but you don't need it to, because tonight its job isn't to explain, it's to remind. That mystery, even when measured, never really disappears. It just changes clothes. You've almost disappeared into the earth now, still, silent, your breath sinking in slow magnetic rhythm with the night. The lodestone rests like a punctuation mark beside you. Not an exclamation, not a question, just a quiet period. Final, faint, certain. But even as science swept aside the souls, the hunger, the ether, the sleeping awareness, one thing remained. We still don't fully understand magnetism, You rise gently through thought, floating not back to the Greeks or the monks or the alchemists, but to now, to the sleek labs and superconductors, to the glowing whiteboards of theoretical physicists, to satellites orbiting the planet-tracking magnetic field anomalies in the South Atlantic. You might expect this to be the part of the story where everything is solved, where the curtain is pulled back, where the secret is revealed. But it isn't, because even today, scientists still argue, gently, sleepily, in conferences and Zoom calls, about what magnetic fields are, not how they work. We know that part well enough to build trains that float, to guide surgical instruments, to store gigabytes on tiny drives. But what they are? That's harder. Magnetic fields emerge from electric currents, from moving charges, from spinning particles, but they don't exist inside the particles. They emerge around them, like an aura, like a shadow cast by movement. And when those particles stop, the field vanishes. Or does it? You imagine now a particle spinning in the dark, its tiny electric heart humming. Around it, space itself warps, not with mass like gravity, but with intention, as if reality is leaning in slightly, listening. Here's your final scientific breadcrumb. All known magnetism is the result of quantum spin and orbital angular momentum. But why electrons spin at all? Why they generate these specific fields? No one knows. It just happens. And here's your fringe final whisper. Some theorists speculate that all forces, magnetism, gravity, the strong and weak nuclear interactions, are just different facets of a single unified field. The theory of everything. We haven't found it yet, but it's out there, waiting. Like a lodestone, still, silent, pulling. You breathe again, a deep, slow inhale. You think about all those centuries of thinkers, fumbling with metaphors, building bridges from what they felt to what they knew. And in some ways you realize they weren't wrong. Not entirely. Because if a magnet pulls without touching, moves without pushing, orders without speaking, well, what else do you call that if not soul? You don't need to believe it's alive, but you can still admire its mystery. You can still feel the tug in your chest when you hold one close, watch the paperclip jump and think, why? And that little why, that question with no answer, is what keeps us human, keeps us curious, keeps us gently awake even as the world pulls us towards sleep. Now let everything soften. Let the edges blur. Let the questions grow faint. You're no longer lying under a fig tree in Greece, or beside a friar's desk, or inside an alchemist's workshop. You're simply here, breathing, still. The lodestone, wherever it rests now, on your nightstand, in your imagination, in the long shadows of history, doesn't need to be explained tonight. It just needs to be remembered, not for its pull or its use or its story, but for its silence, the way it says everything without sound. Let your limbs grow heavier now. Let your thoughts loosen like iron filings drifting in a quiet field. The world is not pushing you to sleep. It's inviting you, gently, magnetically. There are no answers you need to chase, no ideas left to hold, just a hum, a pulse, a quiet, ancient rhythm that flows through every planet, every compass, every tiny particle that spins for reasons we may never know. Feel the slow tide of sleep come closer, no rush, no force, just a soft alignment. You are magnetic, not because you pull, but because you belong. So rest, let the night hold you. Let the mystery hum. Let the soul of the stone, real or imagined, guide you gently to sleep. You are aligned. You are still. You are home.